It was a warm summer afternoon in Atlanta, the kind of day when the sunlight dances off the streets and laughter echoes from every corner. But on this particular day, there was an air of anticipation around Steve Harvey. He sat in the back seat of a sleek black SUV, glancing out the window at the passing cityscape. His thoughts raced faster than the car's wheels as his mind replayed the upcoming moment. Today wasn't like any other day. Today wasn't about the jokes, the game show, or the spotlight. Today was deeply personal. In his hand, he held a small, simple gift wrapped with care. It wasn't expensive or flashy, but its significance far surpassed anything money could buy. The gift was for someone who had unknowingly shaped the man he had become. Someone who had seen potential in a young boy that the world had already written off. That woman was Miss Eleanor Harris, his high school English teacher. As the car pulled into a modest community center, Steve felt a pang of nostalgia. The building's brick facade, slightly weathered by time, reminded him of his own high school days back in Cleveland. Memories flooded back, the hallways filled with the hum of chatter, the scent of old textbooks, the sound of lockers slamming shut. But among all the memories, one figure stood out. Miss Harris had been more than just a teacher. She was a mentor, a guide, and a beacon of belief when Steve had none left in himself. Steve stepped out of the car, adjusting his tie as he looked around. A small crowd had gathered, teachers and staff from a nearby high school eager to hear Steve speak. But what they didn't know was that Steve had something far more personal planned for the day, something that would surprise them all. As he entered the community center, Steve could feel the buzz in the air. Teachers, young and old, were mingling, sharing stories of their students, the challenges they faced, and the victories they celebrated. These were the unsung heroes, the ones who often went without recognition, yet who shaped the futures of so many. Steve couldn't help but smile at the thought. This wasn't about him today, it was about them, about the impact teachers had on lives. The event began with a warm welcome from the school principal, a kind woman in her 50s. She spoke passionately about the importance of educators. Teachers don't just teach, she said. They inspire, they nurture, and sometimes they save lives. Steve felt a lump form in his throat. He knew just how true that statement was. Without the belief of one special teacher, he might never have made it to this stage. Now, the principal continued, it is my great pleasure to introduce a man who needs no introduction, Steve Harvey. The room erupted in applause as Steve walked onto the stage, his commanding presence and charismatic smile immediately taking center stage. But today, his usual confidence was tempered by something more profound, a sense of gratitude, even nervousness. After all, he wasn't just here to entertain. He was here to honor someone who had made a difference in his life. Good afternoon, everybody, Steve began, his voice booming with warmth. First of all, let me say this. You all are the real stars. You're the ones who make a difference every single day. Without teachers like you, there wouldn't be people like me. The audience chuckled lightly, but Steve's tone quickly turned more serious. Growing up in Cleveland, I wasn't the smartest kid. I stuttered, I struggled with reading, and I didn't always believe in myself. But there was one person who did. One person who saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. Her name is Mrs. Eleanor Harris, and she was my English teacher. The room grew quiet as Steve's voice thickened with emotion. I remember one day, she asked us to write about what we wanted to be when we grew up. I wrote that I wanted to be on TV. Now, most teachers would have laughed at a kid like me saying something like that, but not Mrs. Harris. She looked me in the eye and said, Steve, if that's what you want to do, then you better get ready because one day you're going to be great. The room erupted in applause, but Steve raised his hand to quiet them. That moment changed everything for me, he continued, his voice trembling. For the first time, I believed that maybe, just maybe, I could be more than what the world expected me to be. Reaching into his pocket, Steve pulled out the small package. His voice faltered as he spoke again. Now, I don't know if Mrs. Harris is here today, he began. Suddenly, the principal stood and motioned for someone to come to the front. The crowd turned, and there she was, Miss Eleanor Harris, the woman who had shaped Steve's life, making her way slowly to the stage. The room erupted into cheers. Steve's eyes widened in disbelief. "Mrs. Harris?" he whispered, barely able to contain his emotion. The two locked eyes, and before Steve could say another word, she wrapped him in a tight embrace. The audience cheered even louder as Steve held her tightly, his voice cracking with gratitude. "You have no idea what this means to me," Steve said, his voice thick with emotion. "You believed in me when no one else did." Mrs. Harris smiled, pride evident on her face. "I always knew you were destined for greatness, Steve." As they sat together on the stage, Steve handed her the small package. With trembling hands, Mrs. Harris opened it to reveal a gold-plated pen, engraved with the words, "To Mrs. Harris, the teacher who changed my life." Tears welled in Mrs. Harris's eyes as she held the pen in her hands. "This is beautiful, Steve," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "But you know what's even more beautiful? Watching you fulfill your dream." The event ended with a standing ovation, the room filled with tears of gratitude and appreciation. For Steve, it was the perfect moment of closure, a chance to honor the woman who had seen his potential long before anyone else had. For Mrs. Harris, it was a reminder that the seeds she had planted all those years ago had grown into something extraordinary. As the crowd began to settle, Steve turned to them, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You see, this moment right here, this is proof that one person can make all the difference. One word of encouragement, one moment of belief, it can change a life forever." Mrs. Harris smiled softly at him. "It wasn't just my belief in you that got you here, Steve," she said. "It was your determination, your drive. You didn't give up, even when it got hard." Steve nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. "But it all started with you," he replied. "You saw something in me when I couldn't see it myself, and that's why I'm standing here today." The audience was moved by the exchange, and soon others began sharing their own stories of teachers who had made a difference in their lives. A middle-aged woman stood and recalled how her math teacher had stayed late every day to tutor her, helping her pass a class she had almost failed. A young man spoke about his history teacher who had inspired him to pursue a career in law by teaching him to see the world from multiple perspectives. Each story added to the growing sense of gratitude and respect in the room. But it was a young girl, no older than 12, who delivered the most powerful message. She stood up nervously, clutching the microphone, and spoke softly. "I don't know if I'm supposed to talk, but I just wanted to say thank you to all the teachers here. I don't have a teacher like Mrs. Harris in my life, but hearing this story gives me hope that one day I will." The room fell silent as the weight of her words settled over everyone like a heavy blanket. Steve, visibly moved, stepped off the stage and walked toward her. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Lila," she replied, her hands trembling as she held the microphone. "You just inspired every single person in this room, including me," Steve said. "And I promise you, there are teachers out there who will believe in you, just like Mrs. Harris believed in me. You just keep being the amazing person you are, okay?" Lila nodded, her eyes brimming with tears, and the crowd erupted in applause. Back on stage, Steve's voice rang out, stronger than ever. "I want to say one last thing before we wrap up. Mrs. Harris didn't just change my life, she gave me the tools to change the lives of others. And that's what great teachers do. They create a ripple effect that goes far beyond the classroom." Turning to Mrs. Harris, he added, "You didn't just teach me English, you taught me how to believe in myself. And for that, I will be forever grateful." As the audience rose to their feet, the applause thundered. Steve and Mrs. Harris stood together on stage, their hands clasped, taking in the moment. It wasn't just a reunion, it was a testament to the power of belief, the impact of encouragement, and the enduring legacy of a great teacher. That evening, as Steve reflected on the day's events, he thought about all the teachers who had shaped lives quietly, without ever expecting recognition. And he thought about Lila, whose bravery had touched everyone in the room. Picking up his phone, Steve opened his notes app and began typing. It wasn't a comedy routine or a speech, it was a pledge. A pledge to start a scholarship fund in Mrs. Harris's name, dedicated to supporting aspiring teachers and students who needed someone to believe in them. Within weeks, the Eleanor Harris Scholarship Fund was born. Donations poured in, and Steve knew that this legacy would continue for generations to come. Years later, Mrs. Harris, now in her 90s, took the stage to accept an award. As she spoke, Steve watched with pride, knowing that her belief had sparked something far greater than she could have ever imagined. The smallest acts of kindness can create the biggest waves. Mrs. Harris had taught him that, and now that lesson would live on forever.